I've never really liked Fate. Um, while it does do its job as a generic system, there's such a thing as too generic. The problem with Fate is that while it's often held up as some standard for what a good generic system should look like, it's just not. In fact, this is very complicated for newer players, especially newer game masters, and even more so for those who are coming over having only played D20 based role playing systems. You need a fancy set of dice, you need to come up with a whole concept for a world from scratch. And I was done with Fate, I really was, until I was introduced to the Dresden Files role-playing game by the folks at my friendly local game store. I went over this briefly before, but the Dresden Files is a series by Jim Butcher, and it's an urban fantasy about a wizard private investigator, and over the course of the series we get to see his adventures. And it's a great series, by the way, you should check it out. But more importantly, this book, Your Story from the Dresden Files RPG, published by Evil Hat, this saved Fate for me. And a lot of people do have problems with the Dresden Files core book. And in my opinion, these are the same people that enjoy regular Fate. Where to begin? First of all, it's a pretty thick book, actually. It's really big, and it has a lot of content. And it goes for $50 US, which for a book this size is pretty fair. That's about the standard. You'd pay more for much smaller Dungeons & Dragons books, let me tell you. But, unlike regular Fate, this book is just chock full of information. And one of the reasons I don't like Fate, and I promise I'll stop covering just Fate at some point, but Fate, the rulebook is less than 10% useful information in my opinion. Most of it is just, forgive the phrasing, but most of it is a circle jerk over how great it is and how you don't need to roll dice to have fun. Kind of like what they do in World of Darkness. And just like in World of Darkness, they say, you don't need to roll dice to have fun, but you need to buy all these new dice anyway. It's ridiculous. But in the Dresden Files RPG, where to begin? And I can tell you right now, this is going to be a significantly longer video than usual. It has, first of all, it's written from the perspective of the characters in the Dresden Files. And normally, I hate that. Like, normally, it just turns me off of the book. It doesn't feel right. But in this, it works very well. The context is, within the margins, you have notes from the characters who are writing this exact role-playing game to help prepare mortals for the supernatural world. And to that end, this is one of the few rulebooks that I have read cover to cover, like, all in one go. It's insane. So, I do have a few problems with the book, and we'll get to that, but first and foremost, we'll go chapter by chapter here. It opens up with a brief explanation of the Dresden Files. And it does a good job. You do not need to be a fan of the series to enjoy this game. In some games based on existing properties, it pretty much banks on you knowing the universe to run the game. This isn't the same. So, the second chapter here is all about fate and how it works. And it's decently well written. I should point out, too, because this is a very big thing for me, the artwork in this book is phenomenal. It is really well done, and they sprinkle it liberally about. And unlike in Changeling, the art in this book is very diverse. It's not just portraits of characters. It's really nice. So, it'll go on, but there's more to this game. For instance, this is a game that encourages you, in fact, almost requires you, to sit down as a gaming group and build your characters together. The character sheet itself asks that you know 2 of the other player characters ahead of time from previous adventures. I have since incorporated this into nearly all of my games across systems. It's great. It also has a chapter on building a city together as a team. And if you don't have time for that, it has rules for if you'd like to build a city on the fly. Maybe you have a group that travels around a lot and you're not quite sure where they're going to go. It's great. So I will go over the main mechanics of Fate, because that is a big portion of this book in a later video. But for right now, I can tell you that one of the things that sets it apart from the base Fate is that it has something called templates in character creation. You can think of a template as kind of a cross between your race and class in more traditional role-playing games. So these templates are things like, say, pure mortal, someone with no supernatural ties, or a changeling, someone who's half fairy. Perhaps you're an emissary of power, which is one of my favorites because it's like the most generic possible. It's the one that says, hey, I can do something, and I'm going to work with my storyteller. Sorry, I'm still stuck in World of Darkness mode here. But I'm going to work with my game master to tell a better story. We're going to work together. And while I normally look down on rules-light systems, such as Fate, the Dresden Files is far from rules-light. In fact, if you are a fan of rules-light systems, you will not like the Dresden Files, and I highly recommend you pick up Dresden Files Accelerated for the Fate Accelerated system. So, it gives you a decent amount of character creation choices, and while some of the things might be a little confusing, for instance, there's a template called Minor Talent, and another called, oh, look at me stumbling right now. This is why we write scripts and things. So there's minor talents and sorcerers and wizards and focused practitioners. They can all do magic, but they do magic a little differently. So that's one thing that is a little bit difficult, and I really recommend more than other games that your game master read through character creation before you sit down as a table to do it together. Then it has, of course, a chapter on advancing your characters, and it's decent. It gives you its milestone leveling. So you don't get experience like you might in other games. Every once in a while, your game master will tell you you've hit either a minor milestone or a significant milestone or a major milestone, and something happens different with each of those. And it gives you a number of sessions that you might want to reward those at. One of the things that the book acknowledges about the system and one of its flaws is that it's very difficult to have a long-lasting campaign in the Dresden Files because of how quickly your characters might gain power. You might quickly realize as the game master that you've given out a little too many milestones, and your players can now take out just about anything that comes their way. And we'll get to that more when we talk about the mechanics of the Dresden Files, but it is very easy to build a character in this game that is significantly more powerful than the others at the table. And in this game, that's a good thing. It is celebrated. For instance, the Vanilla Mortal template has so little going for it on the surface that you might think, why would anyone take this? but a lot of people do. It does have its advantages. Just because there is a quote-unquote weaker class in this game doesn't mean that people are going to avoid it, because it might make up for it in other ways. Another interesting part of this game is that your cities that your stories take place in can advance as well. They can, quote-unquote, level up. And it even has little information in it for if you'd like to link your city to your characters, and what kind of milestones your characters might get when they resolve certain things throughout the city. So next we go on to aspects. This is the most important part of the game. Fate relies on aspects, and normally I wouldn't talk about this until a mechanics video, but it's important for this game. So in Fate and the Dresden Files, by extension, your character and literally everything else in the world has something called aspects. And an aspect is the core mechanic of the game. So instead of having flat bonuses to things as your character, you can what's called call on an aspect to increase your likelihood of success, or you can call on an enemy's aspect to hinder theirs. You can even use the aspects of the individual scenes you're playing in to your advantage. Now that said, you as the player are not going to know the aspects your enemies have. It's up to you to discover those as the game goes on. The only aspects that you might know immediately are yours and the ones in your city. So, like I said, I will be going over this in much more detail. I'd really like to just cover the book here. But it should tell you something that the aspects chapter is a very thick portion of a very thick book. Okay, so then it goes on to skills. You know skills. You know skills. They're in every game you've ever played. Trust me. So, and it has your normal ones. In fact, the skills list is very, very similar to that of D20 Modern, with some shrinking done. For instance, all of your physical skills are listed under athletics instead of being individual ones. And the skills chapter is very nice because it tells you, of course, all the different uses of the skills, but it also gives you plenty of examples throughout the chapter that your GM might use. Fate is a system that very much rewards thinking outside of the box. So, another thing that's really important with this system, and again, I am not normally a fan of this, and I don't know why I love it so much in the Dresden Files, but it gives you plenty of alternate uses, alternate solutions to your problems that you might make with skills. For instance, a character who doesn't drive might use a skill like contacts to get around their city faster instead of driving. It's very interesting. So, real quick, I'll cover combat. Basically, the way this works is you have 3 kinds of conflict. There's physical, mental, and social conflict. If you take stress, which is determined by your character's, your skills, honestly, rather than statistics, if you take a certain amount of stress, you're going to take what's called a consequence. And a consequence will give you a temporary aspect. And this is something like a really bad bruise, or something as severe as a broken leg, or to give an example straight out of the Dresden Files, I burned half my hand off. So consequences range from mild to severe, and it's intense. So another thing that's great about this game is that it has... it has a lot of rules for things like losing the game. If you're going to lose a combat, you can instead choose to lose on your own terms and still get something out of it. And one of the most interesting mechanics in this game is the player's ability to say, I'm not going to take part in this scene, and instead their character automatically succeeds at something off screen. And you might think that people could abuse that, and you're right, they absolutely could. But in my experience, nobody does. People only do that if they really feel that their character won't add much to the current scene. And if they're comfortable with sitting out for a few minutes to watch everyone else have fun, more power to them. So one of the last things I want to talk about here, and this is across all of the Dresden RPG books, and believe me, I will get to them, but it has a setting in the back of it. After the GM's chapter on building scenarios, it has a chapter on it on Baltimore, if you wanted to use Baltimore as a setting. And in here, they've called it Nevermore, and they tell you all about what is in supernatural Baltimore. And in a lot of it, they tell you kind of how they came to that conclusion earlier in the book. They tell you how they built everything. So, and the Baltimore chapter is phenomenal, by the way. It is a great setting. And it's something you could run right away with, just like with the rest of the Dresden Files role-playing game books. It comes with plenty of threats to face. It comes with NPCs, both helpful and aggressive, and it comes with just all this information. One of the problems I have with Fate is how much trouble it can be to set up a campaign for a GM, and that's especially important to someone like me who runs so many games. But it's amazing. They have given you everything you need to know about Baltimore. For the purposes of the game, of course, not like literal actual Baltimore. So, I'm now going to talk about things I actually don't like about the book itself. While it is laid out amusingly as the story of these characters creating a role-playing game together, it is laid out very poorly. It can, even with the index in the back, it can still be kind of hard to navigate around the book. Some things, like how magic and spells work, might be found outside of the chapter on magic, for example. This book, while it is a great rewarding system, can be a pain in the ass to navigate. And that's something you're going to want to keep in mind if you ever pick this up. This book is not one that you can just pick up and learn the game immediately. Again, if you're doing that, grab Accelerated. The Dresden Files Accelerated. But it's such a great book, and it makes me so sad that it has all of the information almost randomly laid about from my perspective. That said, I don't design games, I just play them. I don't know what makes... In all honesty, I do not know from, say, a marketing perspective how any of this actually works. All I can tell you is that this book could use a little work. One of the things in the system that you might think would be easier but isn't is, magic. For a book and setting about magic, this game's magic system is one of the more complicated things I've ever seen. People ask all the time in the forums online, how does magic work? How does a spell work? In fact, I'm not ashamed to admit that I ran this game for several months as a GM before I figured out how magic actually worked, and even then I slipped up a lot. So, this has gone on for long enough with me talking about the book, and you can definitely look forward to several videos covering the mechanics later on. But for now, all I can tell you is if you are a fan of the Dresden Files, or if you are a fan of urban fantasy, or if you're looking for something that's not Dungeons & Dragons to try out this role-playing season, pick up the Dresden Files. You might be surprised by what you find in the book. Have a great evening.